dolorido por la pérdida de un padre que hemos perdido, que es el guía y faro de Cuba y de América Latina y prácticamente del mundo.
Me siento muy feliz, no por la muerte de un ser humano, sino de un dictador.
Even in death, Fidel Castro still divides the world. To his supporters, he was the champion of socialism and anti-imperialism. But to his critics, he was a dictator who oversaw numerous human rights abuses inflicted on the people of Cuba. Fidel Castro became a national hero and president after overthrowing US-backed dictator Batista in a revolution in 1959. He stood up to the United States, which had exploited the island ever since it won independence from Spain in 1898. Castro ended years of corrupt rule and introduced free healthcare and education for the Cuban people. American-owned businesses came under state control, and the economy centrally planned. But to his enemies, Castro turned Cuba into the world's largest open-air prison. Food, clothing, and books were in short supply, and travel, business, and freedom of thought forbidden. More than 3 million people fled Castro's regime, with hundreds of thousands risking death to travel by boat across the Florida Straits to Miami.
Cuba y la revolución cubana seguirían luchando y seguirían resistiendo.
Fidel Castro ruled Cuba for nearly 5 decades before handing over power to his brother Raúl in 2008. Castro escaped more than 600 assassination attempts and lived through 10 US presidents. To the United States, Castro was seen as the enemy, a communist dictator right on their doorstep. From the American embargo in 1961 that sparked decades of economic hardship to a recent thawing in relations with America. US President Barack Obama, who restarted links with Cuba, wrote a careful statement. While his successor, Donald Trump, used a different tone. Castro's relationship with the then USSR put Cuba at the center of the Cold War and of the missile crisis in 1962, when Castro asked the USSR to position nuclear weapons there before backtracking 13 days later. Castro spread his revolutionary ideas to Latin America. He also played a crucial role in shaping Africa's history during the 1960s and 70s. He supported South Africa's struggle with apartheid and sent troops to half a dozen countries in their fight for independence.
We have lost a friend, we have lost a leader, we have lost a real friend who made us to be what we are in many ways.
Castro's legacy will be debated for decades, but his accomplishments and failures of his revolution are on display in Cuba today. Fidel Castro once said that history will absolve him, and now the jury is out. Christine Pirovolakis, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Palm Springs, California, is Christopher P. Baker. He's a journalist, travel writer, and photographer who has visited Cuba more than 100 times in the past 3 decades. And from West Palm Beach, Florida, is George Bennett. He's a political reporter for the Palm Beach Post. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. George Bennett, the man is dead. Was he a hero or a tyrant?
Well, that's not for me to say. I'm a news reporter, not an opinion guy. I can tell you as a Florida reporter that the opinion of Castro in Florida was that he was a brutal dictator. Even it's interesting in reaction to his death, even more liberal members of Congress, emphasized the repression that went on in Cuba, and that's pretty much the widely held opinion in Florida.
Christopher Baker, 1.5 million people fled Cuba. Cuba didn't have 1.5 million rich landowners who were oppressing poor people, so a lot of people didn't like him. A lot of people saw him as a dictator. Is that accurate?
There's some degree of accuracy to that, but it's not the whole picture. Certainly the 1.5 million who left, the majority would have been business people, intellectuals who may have felt suppressed, people whose opportunities were taken from them. But at the same time, there's this other equation. I thought your documentary did a good job of explaining the benefits too. On the island, just to close this point, on the island, there are millions of people who feel that he was a father figure, who love him, and you see this today in the long lines in the Plaza de la Revolucion, those people paying homage.
And Christopher, I guess the question is, if he was that deeply loved, why didn't he ever put it to the test at the ballot box? Why did he never allow for free and fair elections in Cuba?
Oh, that's easily stated. I mean, I met him personally in 2003, and I saw the megalomaniac aspect to his personality. It was his way or the highway. So there were two sides to his character. Certainly the power-hungry personality, but somebody who genuinely did care for the underclass. He had said when he came to the USA in March of 1959, 3 months after the revolution, that elections would follow democracy. Of course, he never had elections, but democracy he defined as when everybody is well-fed, well-clothed, and well-educated.
George Bennett, the free healthcare, the free education, a classless society. Is there a lot of good in that from your perspective? And would some of the Cuban exiles, particularly in Florida, be able to see at least some of that and grant some ground to Castro and Castro supporters to say, hey, there was some good in that?
Yeah, you know, I mean, I've certainly heard a lot about Cuba's literacy rate in the last couple of days. I mean, I just know, again, from a Florida perspective, Cuba is a place where people risk their lives to cross shark-infested waters to get out of there. That's kind of the dominant impression of Cuba that people have in Florida. So, you know, I'm sure, you know, I mean, Mussolini made the trains run on time, so I don't dispute there might have been accomplishments in Cuba, but you know, certainly from a Florida perspective, it's a place that people, you know, risk their lives to get out of.
Yeah, so Christopher, you have, you know, the free healthcare, the free education, a classless society, and then that's juxtaposed with the lack of rights. You know, gays were sent to prison for a long, long time as well. More than 3,500 people killed by firing squad, religion banned, and so on. Was it, Christopher, when you went to the country, did you feel like it was all worth it?
That's, as they say, that's for history to decide, but the balance is both ways. I see the absolute positive at a brutal cost. We all accept the brutal cost. We know what it was. But to the point about rafting too, it's very important to note that the last few decades, almost everybody who left Cuba, continue to leave Cuba, are economic rather than political migrants, but they are treated as political migrants. We have a law in the States that permits any Cuban who reaches US soil to be legal, to stay, and that's a great incentive. And the economic failures of the regime, they're obvious. The communist system has destroyed the economy. We understand that, but at the same time, it's disingenuous for anybody to point to the failures of the system causing this mass migration when at the same time Cuba has had to face 5-6 decades of a US embargo whose very purpose has been to destroy the economy.
George, a lot of what we've been saying revolves around internal policies, domestic policies, you know, the economic collapse and so on. I wonder, when I think of, for example, where I'm from, South Africa, Castro is not seen as anything other than as a hero because he helped fight apartheid. He supported Mandela and the ANC, so people will be celebrating him there right now in death. So is that where his true charisma really lies? It's as a global icon rather than in terms of his policies back home in Cuba?
Well, yeah, again, you know, certainly his reputation in other parts of the world, you know, I can't really speak to. I just know what I've read. I mean, I can just tell you, again, you know, as a reporter in Florida, that there's a very distinct picture of Castro that people have here. And whether people are on the left or right, I think, you know, he was universally seen by folks in Florida as being a repressive dictator.
And George, with his death, is there a belief, particularly amongst the Cuban exiles, that he perhaps has left the country behind that is being more pragmatic now through Raul with the deal with President Obama, that Cuba can be a country that might open up, might be good for business, and might be a country they might want to go back to in future?
Sure. There's been a lot of, you know, I mean, I described a pretty universal opinion that people have here of Castro, but there's been a lot of disagreement even among Cuban Americans about the best way, the best policy towards Cuba, whether to lift the embargo and have more engagement with Cuba. I think, generally speaking, the younger Cuban Americans in Florida have favored lifting the embargo and having more engagement with Cuba.
Christopher, if Batista was not overthrown by Castro, would Cubans be better off today, in your opinion?
Well, you know, I've traveled throughout the Caribbean and written many books on all these destinations. And I can compare Cuba to Dominican Republic, Haiti, and Jamaica, where you have a very well-developed businesses, a middle class and upper class, but you have vast, vast impoverishment. And so this is the Cuba that existed before the revolution, and the purpose of the revolution was to right that boat. Of course, you know, we saw that Castro took long-term power, but at the same time, he alleviated the kinds of poverty, illiteracy, etc., that are still part and parcel of these other destinations, the neighboring states of Cuba. So I think that's a very, very important consideration.
Now, Christopher, very finally, did he really give the superpower, the United States, a bloody nose, or was that all perception and optics?
No, he absolutely did, of course. He represented the worst of the Cold War, in a sense, from Washington's perspective, and he set himself out to stick his finger continually in the eye of Uncle Sam, and he did that brilliantly with the assistance of the Soviet Union. Not least for that reason, I think he's seen as a hero among so many states of the world, of peoples of the world, because you look at 1959 and what it was like, and for many of those countries, the USA appeared like a bully.
Sure, but he's also seen as a hero to people like Robert Mugabe, right? Because they find some sort of inspiration there.
Absolutely, that's true. There's no doubt about that. But he saw himself as David to Goliath. You know, my time with him, I saw this perspective, and he was on the world stage. He loved that theatrical role. He needed the limelight, and he played it brilliantly. I called him a pathological genius.
Okay, gentlemen, we look forward to seeing how this unfolds and how the relationship between Cuba and the United States particularly evolves in the coming weeks, months, and years. Christopher Baker and George Bennett, thank you very much for joining us.